that is very much on our radar screen. It's not only Islamist or jihadi terrorism that's on our radar screen, but also this form of terrorism, which indeed has becoming an issue of increasing concern. The second point, unfortunately, we would say that's not a new issue to us. This has been, and in France at least, this has been an on and off threat for years, for decades even. It somewhat subsided after the war because of the association of the far right with the collaborationists, those who collaborated with the occupying forces in the war, but it made a quick comeback, especially on the occasion of the Algerian War, where we did have a spate of ultra-violent terrorism in France, generated by people who were opposed to General de Gaulle's policy in Algeria, that is the policy of leaving Algeria and leaving independent, allowing Algeria a vote on independence. So it has been very marginal, but it has been, how I put it, sort of background noise for decades in France, with spikes once in a while, driven by geopolitics or social political factors like adverse or hostile reactions to migration or the perceived cultural hegemony of the left, etc., etc. All in all, since the 1970s, we can attribute less than 10 fatalities to far-right terrorism in France. Now, what happens now? Is it a new period? Is there a new threat in France, in Europe, and worldwide? Well, certainly the aftermath of the crisis, the financial crisis, and the economic disruptions thereon have led to a growing feeling of alienation about certain parts of the population. There has been a rekindling of conspiracy theories, so-called great replacement, quote unquote, the supposed nefarious influence of international capital, the usual anti-Semitic trope, and then the mastery of modern social digital tools, which were not very much mastered by these movements up to recently, but now they did a lot of catching up, and that we found out after Christchurch, where you see that these people, these groups, have really been on a very, very quick learning curve. So how do you address this? How do you address this issue? Do you address it like, for instance, the Al-Qaeda or ISIS or this kind of, is there something different? Well, I believe that is an analytical point of view. There is a difference. In fact, by definition, jihadist-inspired terrorism is by definition internationalists. Here you have to deal with very nationally based movements. So you have a sort of patchwork, and as yet there is very scant evidence of a global coordinated approach. You do not have, as yet, so far, I insist on so far, a black shirt international. That's not yet the case. You have opportunistic, interpersonal relationships. People go to train together in backwoods. They echo each other on social networks, but you don't have a sort of the equivalent of Al-Qaeda Central or ISIS Central in the Levant. So first you have to around that to articulate the response. The second element is that you really have to be, well, I believe that words can kill. And so you have to be very much ahead of the narrative, especially avoid the issue of competing narratives. So thinking, we did that because others did that, and then sort of a cycle of action and counteraction. That is very dangerous. We started to have that after the 2015 attacks in Paris, where there was a rekindling, a spike of interest in these movements. So people say, okay, now we have to defend ourselves after 13 November. So in order to stem this phenomenon, you have to be proactive, and especially one thing is a key message for us. You really have to enhance online platforms' accountability with regard to this phenomenon through their own actions, but also through public regulation, democratic regulation, if need be. And if you want to do that, you need international collaboration.
I think we lost Ambassador Karen's connection. All right. Let us just see if he's able to connect back. Agni, if I can just ask you and shift to you for your comments till the ambassador joins back, hopefully very soon, and we can go back to him. All right. Yeah, Agni, could we just come to you?
Sure, of course. It's a shame. I was listening intently to the ambassador's comments. I can actually only underline some of them. I think he was bringing up really valid points, and I'm glad to go before Colin and Hassan because I'm concerned that if I would go after them, I would have very little to add, which I'm certain they will cover lots of bases. But I think just to give perhaps a little bit of the EU perspective here, we've been paying increased attention to this since a couple of years now. It's clearly something member states are very concerned about, and this has also been, of course, fueled by notable global attacks which have had a reverber. So the Christchurch attack really changed also EU policies there, which I think also showcases the globalization of what is the threat itself, in a way, that this something on the other side of the world can really sort of change the policies within the Union as well. So I think, and we've had numerous meetings with member states, and our current priority is really to establish a better situational understanding of what this is. And shall we go back to the ambassador, or shall I finish in between?
You can just quickly finish it. We can go back to the ambassador after this.
Sure. So, and I think one of the key challenges we're really facing in this space is to understand what is it that we constitute as violent right-wing terrorism or extremism. This is exasperated because we have blurred boundaries between what we understand as radical right, which is legitimate political movements, or extreme right, which reject the fundamentals of democracy and aim to achieve their goals through violence. And the reason why this is so important is because many of our legal systems are really built up to respond to banned groups or banned individuals or symbols. And unless we have it, it's difficult to adapt on how we can measure and how we can respond to them. And I think a notable example is also the latest terrorism situation report issued by Europol, where 3 member states reported a total of 6 right-wing terrorist attacks, with 1 completed, 1 foiled, and 4 failed. And 2 of these attacks were reported, which they sort of counted in, but those weren't reported as right-wing extremist attacks. And one of them was the Halle attack in Germany, for example, because the German legislation considers only defines terrorism exclusively as group-based violence, so it can't account for an individual. I think this is just one of the examples of where it's difficult to count and therefore really understand what is the scope of the problem. And I think this is also what Olivier was mentioning before. What is further exasperating the challenge is that this is really a very localized thing. We have lots of local groups, and then we haven't seen this type of global approach to it. So of course we can't necessarily go to the UN and do what we did with sort of the Islamist ideology motivated terrorism. And that is further producing a challenge for the companies who operate at a global level to address some of these important issues. And this is also something we're very much looking at within the Union through the EU Internet Forum and our collaboration with the Global Internet Forum to counter terrorism. And we recently just had a meeting with them, and they also pointed out one of the key issues being that there isn't a coherent understanding what constitutes violent right-wing extremism or terrorism. And it's sort of a mixture, and everyone is trying to struggle to define their own ways. And some of the companies are doing this quite aggressively, which is on the one hand side positive, but that also comes with its own issues of sort of private action against certain groups, and there may be some sort of rule of law issues we're seeing there. And I think we can also see that sort of the company's actions, if we look across the industry, these still rely on the international UN-based lists. But with some exceptions for the Christchurch and Halle attacks, so notable attacks are the exceptions sort of to the rule. But other than that, these actions are still sort of established on the international level. So I think something to just highlight, it's going to be very important going forward that national governments try and ensure that they define, list, and use existing mechanisms and develop new mechanisms to really establish what is and what isn't, to ensure that we move forward on this topic from a rule of law perspective.
All right, okay.
I'll stop there.
Yeah, thanks for that. Ambassador Karen, could we come back to you to finish your remarks?
Yes, I'm not sure at which point it was cut off, but I wanted just to conclude on saying I think I very much agree with what was just said. Indeed, you have an issue of definition, which doesn't make it very easy. And there was a parliamentary committee inquiry of France for the issue. It was a robust, a big dust-up, because people had difficulty agreeing on the definition, and some parliamentarians saying, "Oh well, if you speak about the far right, you have to speak about the far left too." So you have this will get all this kind of competing narratives. I think everything much depends on how the repression system is organized. In France, for instance, you have it's a bit ambiguous. On one hand, it's very easy because you have certain forms of speech that are felonies. If you say these people are responsible for all the evils of the world, that's a felony. You cannot say that. All people are all these people are this and that. It's a felony. Then you can incriminate that. If you get together in the woods with buying guns and train with a view, with the intention of attacking the synagogue, you can go to jail even if you haven't acted on this because it's the famous felony criminal association with a view to committing an offence, which we have been criticized for. So it's sometimes there are difficult issues, but when you have a clear penal framework, it makes things not much easier. You have a lot of case law issues, but at least you have a framework. That gives you something to work with. It's not perfect, but it gives you something to work with. So at least you have an object that you can relate to, and you can build on that.
Right. Okay. Thanks so much for your comments. Before I move to Colin, this is just for the viewers that have tuned in, that you can put your questions in the message box. The last 15-20 minutes we'll keep for a Q&A and pick up a bunch of questions that the viewers have submitted. I'm sure there are going to be a whole bunch of them considering the debates that are around this topic right now. Colin, we've heard two very interesting views from Europe and some very similar debates that we have seen on terrorism previously over the past 20 decades. When you're talking about when we're talking about definitions, and we're talking about how we're going to approach this, and whether even there is consensus on definitions within Europe. And I'll get to that later to our European colleagues. But let's get some insights from the American perspective. We've heard a bunch of things from the Boogaloo movement and a whole other, if I may, comical names that have been attached to such movements. Could you just give us a brief on what's the American view on this?
Sure. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah. Could I request everyone else to mute the mics if possible?
Perfect. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. And I have to say, when Kabir, when you appeared on screen, I almost dropped off the call and decided to back out because I was envious of your haircut, that you've been able to get a proper haircut, and I haven't. But nonetheless, I appreciate being amongst good company. So there's a lot going on, as you noted, in the United States right now, particularly with respect to far-right extremism. And I'll walk through a couple of the kind of high-level points as I see them. The first is, the far right is rising. There's no question about that. That's not my opinion. That's borne out by the data. And any way you kind of slice and dice the data, you're going to come to the same conclusion. There's a great study by the Center for Strategic and International Studies that Seth Jones led that looks at this. And it shows the number of attacks, the number of plots, et cetera. Two, the threat is diverse. I had a piece with Bruce Hoffman a couple of weeks ago in the Cipher brief where we laid this out, and we kind of talked about in the United States, where we used to be concerned more about organizations and groups, we're now more concerned about movements and networks, and that's become increasingly true. Along the same lines, speaking to how diverse the threat is, we've still got threats from neo-Nazis and white supremacists, but added to that, we've got these new permutations and iterations on an old threat, the Boogaloo movement, which is actually not quite as monolithic as it's been presented. It tends to skew far right, but there are Boogaloo members that are marching with Black Lives Matter protesters. What they do have in common with a lot of the anti-government militias in the United States, and there are many of those, is the fact that they are heavily armed and that they do have an antipathy for law enforcement and for government. The other thing that's fairly new is that terrorism has been politicized quite heavily over the last 3.5 years. When the threat was primarily from Salafi jihadists like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, everybody could agree. Now, anytime you say that there's a threat from the far right, the immediate knee-jerk reaction is, well, what about Antifa? What about the left? Why are you ignoring the threat from anarchists? I wrote a piece with Michael Kenny and War on the Rocks laying out what we think Antifa is, what it isn't, and why it matters. But I get pushback on that on a daily basis. Why are you focusing so much on the threat from far right and you never talk about the threat from the far left? My answer is quite simple. I'm concerned about people that are committing murders. I'm not concerned about people that are, doing acts of graffiti and breaking windows at Starbucks. And until I see that equivalent threat from the left, I'm not going to pay as close of attention or elevate it to an equivalent, because it's not an equivalent. And again, that's not my opinion. That's the data. But that's become very politicized in this country. That all leads me to the point to make that the tension is building as we approach November. The president is stoking the fire. You can see by the things that he says on social media in terms of already trying to sow doubt about the integrity of the elections. A lot of us have been saying this for quite a long time, experts like Dan Byman and others, that as we get closer to the election, we are concerned about a level of violence domestically that we haven't seen in this country since the Vietnam War protests, because tensions are high, because partisanship is at a record pace, because we live in a country that's heavily armed, and gun ownership has actually spiked during the pandemic. You've got disinformation layered on top of that, and you've got political unrest surrounding racial issues. So it's a real tinderbox here in the United States. I'm speaking to you today from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which was the site of the Tree of Life attack. In fact, that happened in my neighborhood, 2 years ago in October. And so that all goes against the fact that we do have a bit of a double standard. And I think, some of my colleagues made great points about language matters. Language does matter. When there's an attack by a brown person in this country, the immediate question is, how did he radicalize, or how did she radicalize? When it's a white person, that's only the question that's maybe fourth or fifth in line. First, it becomes about mental health, grievances, all these other issues. Only then do we get to this conversation surrounding radicalization. And I think that's a mistake, because we know that the far right, jihadis had martyrdom videos, the far right has manifestos. And we've seen the increasing popularity of icons, folks like the Christchurch attacker, Brenton Tarrant, folks like Anders Breivik in Norway. Even, if you want to include incels in this mix, And I think there is a connection between the so-called incel ideology and far-right extremism, and that connective tissue is in the form of violent misogyny and the way that they talk about feminism and women in general. So I think what I'll conclude with is I think we do need to pay very close attention to the language that's used, to these icons and martyrs, to these manifestos, and also let's not discount memes, right? Some people look at memes, people from maybe my parents' generation, and say, oh, it's a silly cartoon. I would caution that kind of flippant attitude toward memes, because they're actually soft-pedaling recruitment. And I've seen a number of anti-Semitic memes. That's a way to introduce younger generations into this movement, to kind of downplay things like the Holocaust and make them seem like they're funny or not that big of a deal. And that's the entryway into the world of the far right. A lot of this recruitment takes place in online gaming platforms, so that's another area of concern. So we've got a whole bunch of issues in the United States at the moment, and I'm typically a very sober threat assessor, but I see a number of red flags, particularly as we approach November. So thank you for allowing me to share my thoughts, and look forward to the discussion.
Excellent. Thanks, Colin. And that's a lot of food for thought, and I'll come back to you in a couple of minutes. Asan, last year we were sitting across the table discussing countering violent extremism and so on and so forth. And between our conversations, I remember we never discussed in great detail far right. And I think it has developed a lot since in the past couple of months. As a practitioner, especially at the Commonwealth Secretariat, how do you see this challenge compared to the usual or the general PVE research and work that you've conducted previously? And what are the different challenges you see here in getting answers for these kind of questions that are being posed by the far right?
Sure. So firstly, evening all, everyone in India, and afternoon and morning to everyone else, wherever you are. Hope you're well. Thank you to the ORF for inviting me. And Kabir, it's good to see you again. I was hoping I'd go before Colin, because he's the expert in all this, but I guess I'm after, so I'll try and say what I can. So in opening, I think I need to give a little bit of context to the Commonwealth's work, just a short bit, just so you understand where we're coming from. So the Commonwealth is an intergovernmental organization, and we're made up of 54 member states, spanning from Canada all the way through to New Zealand. And just to sort of clarify, we're not the FCO. Often we get confused with that, but we're not the FCO. So what our primary focus as a CV unit has been on what we term tier 2 countries. And what we mean by that is countries that have a new or developing CV issue. So that means we don't really focus on countries with an existing CV infrastructure, such as Canada, UK, Australia. So because of that, and just to sort of, I guess, understand that context, our interventions thus far has not really focused or hasn't focused on right-wing extremism. However, what I can say, and I've sort of been thinking about this, is I'll say the following, and hopefully you'll see some similarities with the work we've done with other forms of violent extremist ideology, well, specifically, I guess, around Islamist violent extremism. And you'll hopefully see some of the similarities and some of the differences. So I think it's fair to say extremists of all persuasions, generally speaking, seek to provide a simple explanation to what is really a complex issue. So i.e. the black and white viewing of a situation and the offering of black and white solutions. I think some of the drivers to right-wing extremism are often similar to Islamist ones, i.e. disenfranchised, needing to be part of something, belonging, identity, all of some of those key drivers. I think there was a mention of, I think Colin mentioned, how did he phrase it? Jihadists have videos and far right have manifestos. So I think something I heard from Vidya, who I believe is contributing to your event or conference yesterday or today. She mentioned there is this, the complexity of the ideology isn't really understood by some members of the far right. So for example, do those who write manifestos, do they really understand those manifestos and follow it to the T, or is it just they read the top headline and say, yeah, this is what we were fighting for. So that's something to sort of bear in mind. Something else, ideology alone does not radicalize. Individuals who are recruited are mainly recruited via propaganda and linking first and foremost to their grievances. So that's also something to bear in mind. I already mentioned the status belonging identity and power. So I guess sort of slightly moving on, how do we go about addressing this challenge? So for the Commonwealth, I guess we could look to New Zealand as a good example to cite. So if we look at the Christchurch attacks, the Prime Minister put in a lot of measures, including the banning the sale of firearms, and obviously that's at the perhaps the more sort of legislation end. But in addition, the Christchurch call to action, as I'm sure you all are aware, called governments, a number of governments to action, including some key stakeholders, i.e. the social media companies, to work together to eliminate terrorism and violent extremism. And that's where you know, capacity building programs can come in to tackle some of the online stuff. I think tackling some of the offline stuff is interesting. And an example I can cite is Australia. They have something called the Compact Initiative, which is specifically focused in New South Wales. And what that does, it aims to build community resilience. And the approach there, I like that particular approach because it doesn't go in to address CV as a standalone issue, but it takes into consideration the wider the wider environment. Sorry. So the other thing I perhaps should add to the mix, and I think that's quite important for us to, as the Commonwealth, and I guess wider consider is this whole debate around reciprocal radicalization. So does one feed off the other? So some argue that far-right extremism and Islamist extremism feed off one another. And if we don't go about addressing them, the situation will deteriorate. Now, one question is, did they appear in a vacuum? Did one come first and then the other came? Or was there something way before that? Again, that's something that needs to be investigated. You can't just say, because of, for example, in East London, where I used to work in one particular local authority, you can't just say Islamist extremism was there first and then the EDL or the far right groups came in afterwards. You know, they were always there. You know, then this came about as a grievance, and then obviously, you know, this reciprocal radicalization debate was ongoing at that time. I think Colin mentioned the idea of loners. I think needs to be investigated. It's always from what I've read and heard, it's always a social dynamic. The loner thing isn't, well, I think it needs to be looked at a bit more. I'm not an academic, so I'm just sort of being quite careful with what I say, but it needs to be looked at a bit more. I think the other interesting thing that I sort of read and heard was, I want to word this carefully. It's really important to perhaps look at far right and the military, and not to say the military is linked to far right groups, but from looking at some of the documents and papers around the foreign terrorist fighters in the Ukraine, the right wing in the Balkans, in the US and the UK, there have been a lot who were in some way previously part of the military. So I think there's something there that needs to be looked at a bit more. So just finishing off, what's the way forward? The ambassador and others mentioned earlier that definitions are key, and I think that's absolutely right. In the work we've done with Islamist-related extremism, you know, one size doesn't fit all. You can't just say, for example, in South Asia, you've got AQ in their various sort of regions, and then you've got ISIS, and they're all fighting each other, and no one's friends. If the untrained eye went in and just sort of did one size fits all, then obviously you're not going to get anywhere. So definitions are key. I did have a quote about that somewhere, but I've kind of misplaced that. But definitions are key. Get media involved. I think, unfortunately, and this was somewhat referred to earlier, the media, the reporting style when it comes to far-right extremist incidents doesn't help the matter, and I think that perhaps adds to the issue from both Islamist and also the far-right point of view. What was mentioned also earlier is around, particularly around definitions and political movements. I think again there's a line. It's quite delicate there, so there needs to be a balance. Some of the other things, just final 2 points to mention. In terms of our work, I think knowledge exchange would be quite key. So, for example, if I went to a country, a Commonwealth country in Africa who don't have perhaps a far right issue, knowledge exchange is something that's quite key. So, for example, talking about right-wing extremism in this country, that country, and then Islamists, and talking about some of the similarities, that's always quite useful and beneficial to the member countries. And as I mentioned about the Australian model, wider structural inequalities need to be addressed. Now, if, for example, you just perhaps in certain countries you ban the sale of firearms and ban this movement and that movement, the anger and hatred from certain groups and individuals are still there. Those things, those structural inequalities still need to be addressed. So I'll end there. There's quite a lot I said there. Hopefully I didn't go over my time. And happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I think that was a very interesting short talk. Let me just quickly go and pose a question to both Ambassador Karen and Agne, which I've been curious about for a while actually. So understanding, we've already sort of highlighted that it is difficult to define even right-wing terrorism. Like, where do you start and where do you stop, and what are the lines? And when at least from a legal framework perspective, perhaps, is there a unionized sort of cohesive opinion that this is a threat that all members of the European continent need to work together on, or are there more challenges, as we have seen that populist leaders have been elected world over in some countries, and there seems to be a thin line between what is seen as right-wing activism and what is seen as right-wing extremism. What's a European thought on this, and not just maybe the French or the German, but is the continent seeing this as a rising threat perception for them?
Well, should I go first, or?
Yeah, you can go first.
Yeah. How I put it, I think we, legally speaking, you have to be very careful, because that what you can define for legal purposes is either actionable speech or actions towards violence or preparation for violence. When you go beyond that, you go into definitional issues, saying we have to have legal action against right-wing violence, for instance. That gets very tricky.
Oh dear, do we lose Ambassador again?
Looks like we dropped him off again.
All right. Agne, could I just shift to you?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, that's a bit of a pickle to answer. There is no unified definition.
Speech, like saying all people have this characteristic on how that and that. So you have a difficulty. So it's difficult to say we have common action against right-wing violence, because you would have a definitional issue. So I think that is very more productive. The first stage, at least, is to focus on behaviors and actions which enable to capture actions which would be carried out by anybody, whatever the motivation. That is, I think, that's the point. Whatever the motivation, you have to criminalize certain types of actions or speech. That's, I think, keeps more objective and makes it more likely to withstand the scrutiny of in a judicial court, for instance. And after that, you have political action, which is a bit different. You have to get a certain understanding of what is the issue at hand. I'm not privy to the last discussion about the issue. I think there's some good degree of convergence in Europe as to the fact that there is an issue, that there's a problem. We don't ignore it. Beyond that, I'm quite certain that we'll have find some nuances and variations among different countries as to what is really difficult, what is really constitute a dangerous phenomenon. And that's part of the European game, I guess.
All right. Thanks, Ambassador Agne. Could I just shift to you?
Sure. No, I think just underlying what Ambassador Caron was saying. It's basically that. I mean, of course, we have an understanding that there are certain actions which are criminal across the Union. And that is there is a directive which has harmonized that part. So actions which constitute terrorist offenses. So there is an understanding there, and there are considerable developments within the Council. The German presidency has made it one of their priorities to also tackle violent right-wing extremism. This was also a key priority of the Finnish presidency in the last year. And so there is a variety of how much different member states are influenced by this. And this is also something that we discussed earlier. Some of these movements are very national and very localized, not even pertaining to the nation as a whole, but perhaps even only certain counties which are really influenced by them. And then, and I think there we can see that some member states can, so there's, for example, the Nordic resistance movement, which is across the Nordic states. And then you have Blood and Honor, which is in a couple of different member states, but then you have couples which are more national. So it is to a different degree, but I think to allude to your question, there is, of course, a challenge in dealing with this because of the certain, there are political beliefs that may sort of make it more difficult, but I think there is a spectrum of this violent right-wing extremism that across Europe we can sort of all agree that this is something we do need to tackle.
Right. Okay. Thanks, Agne. Colin, seeing it from sort of seeing these threats from a right-wing perspective and seeing these threats as developing in multiple nations now, do you get a sense of deja vu? And we get back to thoughts of definitions being barriers in sort of getting to senses of what right-wing terrorism is, because that's literally what one of the biggest barriers have been of terrorism as a field of research, and for such a long time. Is it the same? Are we heading the same way?
Yeah, I think in many ways we are, because it remains an unresolved question. I've taught for many years now a class called Terrorism and Insurgency, and we spend a lot of time on this fundamental issue of definitions. But it's easy to get caught up in that and not make any progress, right? And so one of the things that I attempt to impress upon my students is, for me, terrorism is politically or ideologically motivated violence, period, right? And if we take that as a starting point, it becomes easier to parse through groups, what their objectives are, what their intentions are, their tactics, techniques, and procedures, right? And then we can get into actually analyzing their organizational structure, their ideology, who might be funding or financing the group, how they go about disseminating propaganda, etc. I just wanted to briefly touch upon something that Agne said, because I think she's right. She talked about Blood and Honor. She talked about Nordic resistance movement. In my work for the Safan Center, we've done a number of analyses on Azov Battalion, Russian Imperial Movement, the Rim. We've got a paper coming out next week on Atomwaffen, which is also going global. I'm less inclined to think that the groups matter as much as the ideology does, because we see these groups shifting names, right? They know the shell game, they know the cat and mouse game. They are attempting to avoid being designated and to avoid scrutiny. But to me, it seems like the ideology is actually growing. And I noticed, not to steal your thunder, a question on there asking if right-wing radicalization across the world is reactionary and not intrinsic. I think it's both. I mean, I think there's an element of reciprocal radicalization, and we see that in Europe, particularly in Germany. But I also think it is intrinsic. These are groups that have been around for a long time. These ideologies may morph and evolve, but fundamentally, a significant amount of the violence we see is perpetrated in pursuance of a white ethno-state, right? And you may have kind of variants of that, and you may over time have kind of other ideologies creep in and maybe kind of in a parasitic form tack on to white supremacy. Again, I'll bring up the incel movement, which is kind of emerging trend that we've seen, particularly in North America and Canada. These conspiracy movements like QAnon. In fact, our intel brief today for the Sufan Center talks about the QAnon movement, which is also going global. But to go back to what you started with, I do feel like we're having some of these same discussions, but we should be better equipped now to recognize what we're seeing, especially the internationalization or transnational element of these groups.
All right, Hassan, very quickly, something that you had mentioned in your talk earlier, and I was just curious about it. Right wing is something, when we're talking from a Commonwealth perspective, is perhaps, as far as movements go, still largely destined for just one or two or three countries. But you did talk about education as being a pivotal point. What kind of outreach do you think is needed here in countries that are not facing this type of radicalization that we are facing, we are discussing today, but they are sitting in their homes and still reading a lot about it, in the West specifically? What's your approach as the Commonwealth Secretariat in both discussing and perhaps offering clarity on the differentiation of threat perceptions when it comes to what's happening in the West, and if let's say you're dealing somewhere in South Asia or in Africa and so
on? Sure. Yeah. Sorry, do you mind repeating the question again? As I unmuted it, cut.
All right. Sorry. I was asking you that you mentioned education in your previous comments, and the kind of right-wing terror and the right-wing movements that we're discussing today are not still very well accustomed in public discourse in most of the Commonwealth countries that your Secretariat currently works in, barring one or two or three of them. And you did mention that education is a very important part here. And because the internet and communications, all of us are still reading about this. So what do you think, what's your approach as an organization? Or do you think it's necessary that you should have an approach as an organization in clarifying to these other countries of actually what is happening in the West at the moment?
Yeah, I think I slightly touched upon this earlier, but definitely I think there's a need to raise awareness of what's going on globally, because the global world is actually a small world when you think about the internet and how it's interconnected. So definitely I think there's a need. I think one of the things we do is, so in certain countries, so I think that the jury's still out about whether interfaith, intercultural programs work well in terms of trying to ensure that everyone can have a cohesive community. There's obviously some that say it works really well, and there's some that say it needs a bit of a stronger evidence base. For us, one of the particular programs that we're doing is something called Faith in the Commonwealth, which works with young leaders around educating them to understand how to navigate the delicate situation of interreligious, intercultural dialogue. And we're doing some of that in places like South Asia, in the Caribbean, and other places where perhaps far-right extremism isn't a thing. But it is sort of tackling some of the issues and some of the drivers. So, for example, the other, in certain countries, if a particular group is a minority, they're considered generally, I guess, as the other. And when you think about far-right extremism and some of the things I mentioned around the otherization, the black and white viewing of things, those kind of programs are important. So I think definitely, along with raising awareness of what's happening, even if it's not a particular thing in that country or region, as well as promoting multiculturalism and intercultural dialogue is very key to educating countries and citizens of those particular countries and regions.
All right. Thanks. That actually makes a lot of sense. So I'm going to take a couple of questions from our audience now, and I'm just going to read it out. So please feel free. It's for all the panelists, and feel free to chime in with your comments. And I think this is a very interesting question, which I've read as in other forms in Western press these days as well. And the viewer asked that is there a problem right now between identifying right-wing terrorism and right-wing activism, and that line is getting finer and finer at the moment? Is that an issue that that is being grappled with at this point in time? Anyone can feel free to chime in.
Yeah, I'll jump in because I'll just go back to what I said earlier, which is, terrorism is politically or ideologically motivated violence, right? So that's the line between activism and terrorism. If there's a violent act, right, typically directed at a person or persons, although not necessarily, we've seen incidents of kind of sabotage or critical infrastructure be counted as terrorism. That to me, that kind of push toward violence, push toward action is what separates, a lot of the activist groups from terrorist groups. Also, there's varying levels, right? It exists on a spectrum. Is this sustained over time? Are there realistic policy goals attached to it that they're trying to get a government to change? And this is where I think, I'll just briefly return to the politicization of terrorism. I've been accused of ignoring left-wing terrorism in the United States, which is kind of silly to me because I don't have a dog in the fight. I'm agnostic to the ideology. I'm just looking at what motivates it. I'm a registered independent. I don't have loyalty to any party or any side. And I have warned, actually, I wrote a piece just after New Year's talking about what the years ahead could bring. I do think we could see a return to left-wing violence, especially as folks that are very passionate about issues like climate change or animal rights feel like their concerns are being ignored and that they have to turn to more violent acts to bring about policy change. And I look at Europeans who, if the Germans think that their government's ignoring their climate, please welcome to the United States, where most politicians, will barely even acknowledge that it exists. So, the choice is often a false one. It's often offered as binary. It's anti-terrorism or right wing. It's left or right wing. We could be entering a period where we have all of these things and a lot more of all of these things. And that's a real challenge for policymakers as we attempt to grapple with the laws, the authorities, and the policies needed, as well as the resources post-COVID to combat all of these, potential threats.
Right. Okay. And I'll just pick something from where what you just mentioned is, of course, how coronavirus has really seems to have at least sort of amplified this right-wing ecosystem. We've seen marches, and it's not just about terrorism. It's about it ranges from just thought process and not wearing a mask and other government policies and so on and so forth. And something that, of course, Ambassador Karen also mentioned earlier is about how economics plays a role in these kind of movements, so to speak. So Colin touched on this a little bit earlier, but let me ask all of you. What's happening right now when we are talking about right-wing extremism, populism, right-wing terrorism? Is this just reactionary, or is this something fundamental that is taking place, which will have a very long-term impact? Or is it something that we will see fluctuate up and down as the situation of the COVID-19 and the economy, either gets better or worse?
I think you're back.
Well, if I may offer just a few thoughts on this. My view, how I see it, of course, this might be reality and facts might start something different in a few years. But at least the experience I have and we have about that is that the drivers have always been there. We've had them for decades. What you have is enablers and circumstances which explain spikes. Like, for instance, we had the German war, there was a spike in alt-right violence, and we had several dozen people killed by the far right in France in the 1960s because of the German issue. So you have fundamental sort of background noise, so to speak, and then you have spikes which require enablers or circumstances or favorable circumstances. I would want to venture a too mechanistic explanation. You know, there's a whole debate about that. What are the circumstances? What is the impact of economic circumstances on violence? But the fact is that when you have unemployment, when you have people who are frustrated, disenfranchised, well, you have more. You just have more. You have a sort of reservoir of people who can be permeable to these kind of approaches. As I think that's a fact of life, and I don't think it's going to leave us anytime soon.
All right, thanks, Ambassador. Hassan, can I just come very quickly to you? And I also want Agnes to chip in here. We saw a lot of populist waves around the Brexit debate between European Union, Europe, and Britain, and that was before coronavirus and before a lot of the current movements that we are seeing took place. Both from the European perspective and the British perspective, were there major takeaways on how to deal with these issues from a policy perspective? Either one of you.
Easy one for me to answer. I was going to say that's easy for me to answer because we, as I was saying earlier, although we're based in the UK, obviously we look at the Commonwealth member states, and that doesn't include Britain because they have a CV infrastructure. But I think from the Brexit debate, generally speaking, as someone from London or from the UK, I think some of the takeaways were around, when you look at Brexit and I guess, what it meant for certain people who voted to leave, it was, as I was mentioning earlier, around the whole issues around frustration, anger, and looking for somewhere to address their grievances. I'm not saying every Brexiter who voted to leave had joined an extremist group, but I think certainly it kind of allowed us Londoners in particular to see that if issues such as frustration and anger are not dealt with, are not heard by the right, they want to leave, and obviously we did leave in the end. Within that, there seemed to have been a rise in certain groups who perhaps could be described as activists, and some perhaps going on to the far right. Things within the CV unit from there, particularly looking at not addressing CV as a direct standalone issue, wider issues, the wider structural inequality that perhaps people have grievances over. And that's generally our approach when it comes to CV. So I hope that sort of answers your question, more from a me being a Londoner point of view.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. Agnes.
Sure. I'm going to stay gracefully silent on the Brexit issue, but I can comment on sort of the COVID implications. And I think something that we have seen, because we're in the early days of this. We don't know how these lockdowns and then the eventual economic downturn is going to influence the extremist behaviors, but of course we know that the underlying elements which can lead to someone being taking the violent route, and I completely agree with Colin here, that is the difference between terrorism and radical views. It's whether you want to use violence to achieve your aims. And that of course doesn't mean that extremist views in general can't be a gateway towards violence, and of course we need to also deal with extremist views as such, but this is not necessarily through counter-terrorism measure. These would be done with digital literacy, with democratization, with ensuring that you have a strong democratic culture, with education. So these, ensuring you have a social structure in place. So these are the measures you would deal with there. With counter-terrorism measures, we're looking at really addressing the violent elements of manifestations of perhaps the spectrum of the same ideology in a way. So I think that's sort of one thing. And I wanted to also come back versus sort of this intrinsic versus reactionary. I mean, Germany just recently disbanded a section of their military, or a group of their military, which is sort of notes that this is both intrinsic and reactionary. And something I found Colin mentioned, which was interesting, to say that now we're focusing not necessarily more on groups, but rather networks and movements. And I think this speaks to why it's so difficult to address violent right-wing extremism. It's because it is so different to this sort of traditional terrorist group approach that we have been going through so far. Even if this group wasn't Islamist, they were still a group. It was still, if we think about the IRA, if we think about some of the groups that were present in Spain, these were still groups, and they had a very sort of logical grouping of it. But these movements are different, and I think this is also why in the EU we really see that member states are concerned about lone actor terrorism, in particular motivated by these things. And I think one of the ways some of the member states have been also tackling this is banning symbols and the manifest, so really trying to ban the elements of what constitutes, or the sort of supporting elements of the ideology. So that's just 2 cents on that.
All right, thanks, Agne. We've run out of time now. It was a great panel. I think this is a topic that's going to be debated for a long period of time to come, and we're going to have many such discussions, hopefully open rather than just on small squares on a screen. Thanks, Agne, Colin, Asan, and Ambassador Karen for joining in, and for the viewers to tune into this debate, sending in your questions. I hope some of them were answered with this. And yeah, thanks for tuning in. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Kabir. You did a great job moderating. Appreciate it. Thanks to all the fellow panelists.
Thanks to all of you. Thank you for everyone who tuned in.